Two archaeologists are working in a cave in Antarctica. The first archaeologist, whom we will call Joe, finds a stone effigy doll figurine. He holds it up to show to his fellow archaeologist, whom we will call Fred. Joe says to Fred, "Hey, look, a caveman designer must have been in this cave." But Fred looked at the figurine doll and said, "No, I say this came about by strict natural material means, like sediment, rain, erosion, wind, and so forth." But Joe said to Fred, "It's designed though, isn't it?" To which Fred replied, "Your hypothesis is only the caveman of the gaps fallacy, just the caveman daddy did it ignorance. But my hypothesis, on the other hand, is simply the default given. Your doll only appears to be designed, but is not really designed." Joe said, "Surely you're not serious." Fred replies, "Yes, your hypothesis is an archaeology science stopper. It's just an argument from ignorance. For example, we once didn't understand the origin of thunder and lightning and other cave rocks, but now we do. So too will we someday understand the strict natural material origins of the doll." To which Joe replied, "But don't objects like this point to a designer?" Fred answered him, "The doll could simply have always been here, uncaused and undesigned, simply have been here from eternity past, exempt from normal cause-effect design inferences." Joe objects and says, "But how could something like this not have had a cause?" Fred answers, "Okay then, smarty pants. Who designed and caused this supposed caveman? Why this special pleading fallacy for the caveman? Where did he come from? What was his name? Why was he in this cave? Why did he do it this way? And what was his favorite color?" Fred continues onwards and says, "You have only come to your design hypothesis because your parents raised you this way. Or maybe you had an emotional experience by some social group that brainwashed you. Your hypothesis is merely an emotional crutch to bring you comfort, feelings, emotions, and so forth. But I, on the other hand, am driven strictly by archaeological science. There is a necessary disconnect between archaeology and your design hypothesis." Joe then says, "Well, I plan to publish the finding of this doll with my design hypothesis to our peers and to the public." To which Fred pushed back and said, "That is just a means to gain money, power, control, and to manipulate others." Joe then says, "But the doll is unique compared to every other feature in the cave." And Fred replied, "You say the doll is unique and appears to be designed only because of observer confirmation bias. For example, so too is the rock that was lying next to the doll also equally 100% unique from every other rock in the cave. Yet notice we are not saying that the other rocks in the cave were designed, are we? Therefore, nor can we say that the doll was designed either." And Fred went on to say, "Besides, sometimes we can look at random cloud formations in the sky and see what appears to be a smiley face, a bunny rabbit shape, and so forth, right? Yet we clearly know that the cloud shapes are only random eventual coincidence. Hence, the same thing is going on here. The doll is not designed. It just appears to be designed. This psychological trick is known as pareidolia." Joe objects and says, "How is eventual random chance of rain, sediment, wind, and erosion ever going to be sufficient to bring about a doll like this?" Fred answers, "Well, sure. short periods of time might not be enough to produce the doll. However, if we give it enough billions of years, then yes, it could happen. And Fred continues, we label your view pseudoscientific archaeology. And how do we know that? Easy, because we hold the microphone and we labeled it that way. Isn't circular reasoning and begging the question wonderful? Joe pushed back yet again and said, well, I have some archaeology textbooks here which attribute objects like this as evidence of caveman designers. And Fred replied, I assert that your archaeology books that talk about caveman design hypotheses are contradictory, morally incoherent, corrupted through transmissions and translations, and therefore cannot be trusted, and therefore no caveman designer made the doll. So Joe tries again and says, but what about all those archaeologists who agree with me? Fred says, my camp holds the majority. Therefore we must be correct. And I say that you are only pushing your agenda of caveman nationalism fairy tales on us. And besides, archaeologists who agree with me are nicer and smarter than the dumb archaeologists like you and your sort. To which Joe replies, ad hominems are not evidence. Joe then tries again and says, how can you hold to this belief? And Fred answers, I do not hold a belief. Instead, I merely lack a belief in your hypothesis. But me, I myself believe nothing. To which Joe answered, well, if you have no confidential belief in your strict material hypothesis here, then why are you even an archaeologist? And Fred answers, well, that's just your truth. It's not my truth. After all, truth is relative and subjective. What's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. And Joe continues to insist, I still say it looks to be designed, to which Fred replied, but notice that if it was designed, it's a poor design. Because notice I can imagine ways in which the face and fingers of the doll could have been designed better. Therefore, I am justified in concluding no designer. Because certainly if there was a designer, he would have done a better job, right? Joe now says, my goodness, how much more evidence will you need? Fred answered, I use the caveman hiddenness pushback. That is, that this supposed caveman should have left more compelling and more convincing evidence of his presence here, enough evidence to convince me personally. But since I remain unconvinced, then it stands to reason that, therefore, a caveman did not design this. In other words, how do we know I'm right? Easy, because I remain unconvinced. Joe then shows Fred a picture of Mount Rushmore as an example of why we should conclude the design hypothesis for the doll. But Fred retorts, oh, yeah, but we have seen designers design such things like Mount Rushmore, therefore we can assume that Mount Rushmore was designed. To which Joe is now thinking to himself, but that's just the point here too, isn't it? Fred continues, I am merely agnostic about the origin of the doll. Nobody can really know. What's wrong with us just saying, we don't know? But under no circumstance can you say, I know, and under no circumstance can you say, it was via a caveman. But you are certainly welcome to say, we don't know. And Fred continued on and said, besides, I've spotted a contradiction in your statements. First you had said, hey, look, a doll figurine. But then a few minutes later you had said, I found it in the corner with dirt stuck to the back of it. Then if it had had dirt on it, why didn't you say that in your first statement? There is no way those two statements can be reconciled and harmonized. Therefore, your hypothesis cannot be trusted, and therefore, no caveman designed the doll. Any attempt by you to show harmony between your two statements is nothing more than you putting on your biased glasses and convenient backpedaling. Fred continued and said, anyone making your claim is the one that bears the burden of proof, but all you have done is to criticize my strict natural material means hypothesis, instead of bolstering or giving evidence for your own design hypothesis. Therefore, your view is wrong. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The more you philosophize me, I will merely repeat to you that you haven't proven anything, and word salad, and not good enough. Lastly, Fred says, besides, since a multiplicity of opinions exist on the matter of doll designers, then none of them can be correct, nor can the main common thread component of designer that unites them all be correct, because multiplicity invalidates all such design hypotheses. Epilogue. Some persons might be tempted to dismiss this entire analogy here because the doll is an inanimate, not living object. But adding life to this equation only makes the problem more acute, not less acute, because now we must explain abiogenesis, that is, how life emerges from non-life, and we must explain replication, lest there be nothing different in the pool of selections for nature to choose from in the first place.